We begin with the latest on Venezuela and captured Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. He is behind bars right now, awaiting his U.S. court appearance on drug charges on Monday.
So we are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and
Donald Trump has just taken the United States into its boldest foreign intervention in years. After the dramatic capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, Trump declared that America will temporarily run Venezuela until a judicious new regime is formed. The headline alone is shocking, but the deeper story is even more unsettling. What happened in Caracas isn't just about Venezuela. It's a warning to every nation in the hemisphere, and Canada is watching this moment more closely than anyone else. The operation unfolded with the kind of speed and force that instantly grabs global attention. Elite U.S. Delta Force units moved into Caracas and extracted Nicolás Maduro, placing him on a plane to the United States, where he now faces federal narco-terrorism charges. Washington insists the mission was lawful, even routine. No invasion, no occupation, simply a high-level arrest carried out by U.S. agents on foreign soil. But that official explanation unraveled almost immediately when Trump announced that the United States would take charge of Venezuela's political transition. He spoke openly about restoring the country's oil production with the help of American energy companies, a statement that changed the entire nature of the mission. What began as a criminal apprehension was suddenly recast as a regime transition project led solely by Washington. While Venezuelans abroad reacted in mixed tones, celebrations from those hoping to return home, anger from others who saw it as foreign domination, the international response grew increasingly tense. Brazil, Mexico, Spain, Chile, and Uruguay condemned the operation as a violation of sovereignty. Russia and China accused the United States of reviving an old doctrine of American hemispheric control. Even some U.S. allies remained noticeably quiet, signaling how uncomfortable they are with the idea of a unilateral American takeover in South America. For Canada, the story lands in an entirely different way. Ottawa now has to interpret what Trump's move means for regional stability, for international law, and for a bilateral relationship already strained by tariffs, trade threats, and unpredictable diplomacy. Trump's announcement after the mission offered the clearest look yet at his second-term worldview. In just a few minutes at the podium, he said the word oil more times than people, democracy, or Venezuela combined. That choice of language matters. It signals that his administration is not only willing to intervene internationally, but is prepared to justify those interventions through the lens of resource protection. The global system that once discouraged unilateral action now seems secondary to what Trump views as America's economic and strategic needs. This shift has been developing for a year. The United States has imposed sweeping tariffs on its own allies, pushed the average U.S. tariff level to heights not seen since the Great Depression, and repeatedly threatened to walk away from long-standing trade agreements, including USMCA. Trump's approach has become a combination of economic leverage, military force, and political pressure, all wrapped into a single aggressive framework aimed at securing U.S. influence in key regions. That is why the Venezuela decision resonates far beyond Caracas. It reveals the formula Trump is now comfortable using. Identify a strategic resource, define it as essential to American security, and act decisively even if international rules or regional partners object. Canada is not in South America, but it is unmistakably in the path of Trump's broader strategy. Canada is the United States' largest foreign supplier of oil. It holds critical minerals that power global supply chains and fuels the clean tech transformation. It provides the uranium that keeps American nuclear reactors running. In other words, Canada is exactly the kind of nation Trump views as strategically indispensable and therefore a potential target for harder U.S. bargaining. Over the last year, Canada has watched the U.S. administration impose new tariffs on Canadian exports, cancel trade discussions with no warning, and openly argued that Canada is giving the United States a raw deal. Trump has also revived an old notion that the U.S. can use economic force to pressure Canada, a message he delivered even before he returned to the White House. When viewed through this evolving pattern, the Venezuela operation becomes something more than a foreign policy headline. It becomes a case study in how the United States might behave when resources, territory, or economic advantage are seen as national security priorities. For Canada, the core issue is not the legality of the mission nor the downfall of a dictator. The concern lies in the precedent Trump has created. By bypassing multilateral systems, dismissing regional partners, and emphasizing resource control, he has signaled that the United States may act alone whenever it believes its interests justify it. No debate, no consultation, no warning. As Canada prepares for the critical 2026 CUSMA review, this precedent casts a long shadow. Trump has already hinted that he may abandon the trade agreement if Canada does not meet his demands. If Venezuela becomes the model for how Washington approaches strategic disputes, Canada must anticipate a far more confrontational negotiation, one that mixes tariffs, political pressure, and the language of national security. Ottawa has already begun adjusting its strategy. Canada is deepening economic ties with Europe and Asia, investing aggressively in critical mineral supply chains, strengthening cooperation with Mexico, and expanding defense partnerships in the Pacific. But Venezuela accelerates the urgency behind all these moves. It demonstrates that the global order Canada relies on, one built on rules, diplomacy, and predictability, is being tested by the very country that helped build it. The capture of Nicolás Maduro will reshape Venezuelan politics for years, but its immediate impact is felt across the entire hemisphere. Trump's announcement that the United States will run Venezuela marks a turning point in American foreign policy. It blends military action, resource strategy, and political ambition into something that middle powers like Canada cannot ignore. For Ottawa, the message is unmistakable. If Washington is willing to impose its will so boldly in Venezuela, then Canada must prepare for a world where old assumptions no longer hold, where even allies may act unilaterally, and where resources, not rules, drive the agenda. As the countdown to the 2026 CUSMA review begins, a larger question emerges. How does Canada protect its sovereignty when its closest partner shows it is willing to break the rules of the game? And more importantly, is Canada ready for whatever move Washington makes next? Canada has been shifting aluminum exports to non-U.S. markets, and that single move has just exposed the biggest flaw in Donald Trump's tariff strategy.
So we had to revert to ship to Europe temporarily over the summer because the transactional price for aluminum was not factoring in the total cost of the tariff. It took some weeks, and finally it has reached a threshold where metal is attracted back into North America, which means that more and more through the coming weeks and months, the end user, the consumer, will be hit by the full impact of the tariff, which will become more and more unsustainable, disruptive, and potentially create some inflationary pushback in the U.S.
When Trump slammed a 50% tariff on Canadian aluminum this summer, Washington expected Ottawa to fold. Instead, Canada calmly redirected nearly half of its aluminum flow to Europe, avoided massive financial losses, and forced the United States to confront the true cost of its own protectionism. As Canada pivoted outward, North America's supposedly integrated supply chain began to crack. U.S. manufacturers faced higher costs, consumers absorbed rising prices, prices, and the political narrative Trump tried to control slipped away. Months later, Canadian aluminum is flowing back into the U.S. market, but only because Americans finally accepted a permanently higher price tag. What Trump intended as punishment has now evolved into a textbook example of how Canada adapts, survives, and ultimately gains leverage in a global economy increasingly shaped by strategic resilience.
The situation with a 50% tariff is highly disruptive for an integrated value chain, industrial value chain like we have in North America. So we were basically losing money shipping to the US. We lost about $600 million over a matter of weeks, which brought Canada, the Canadian producers, to ship or to avoid shipping about 45% of the metal that normally goes to the US, keeping some in Canada and shipping some to Europe.
In June 2025, the Trump administration raised tariffs on Canadian aluminum to 50% under its revived America First industrial strategy. The White House framed the measure as economic self-defense, insisting that Canada was flooding the U.S. with cheap metal. But aluminum isn't optional for American industry. It is an essential input for cars, packaging, aviation, construction, and clean energy systems. And the reality is embarrassingly simple. The U.S. cannot meet its aluminum demand without Canada. When the tariff hit, Canadian producers immediately faced the risk of losing hundreds of millions of dollars in a matter of weeks. They made the rational choice: stop shipping to a distorted market. Roughly 45% of Canada's usual aluminum exports to the United States were pulled back. Some of that metal remained inside Canada, but a significant portion moved to Europe, where long-established commercial relationships made the transition smooth. Canada avoided immense losses, protected full production capacity, and preserved stability in its industry. Throughout the summer, the U.S. market slowly adjusted to the tariff. Prices climbed. Manufacturers complained. And only once American buyers began absorbing the true cost of Trump's decision did Canadian aluminum start returning to the United States, this time at a higher price, with consumers footing the bill. This aluminum pivot tells a larger story about political power, economic strategy, and the limits of American protectionism in 2025. The first lesson is that Canada has options, far more than Trump expected. His team assumed Canada had no alternative market and would be forced to sell into the United States at a loss. That was wrong. Canadian smelters are overwhelmingly located near the coast, meaning they can load ships and reach Europe, Asia, or South America without friction. Canadian companies already have deep footprints in Iceland, Norway, and other European regions, allowing them to redirect production almost instantly. When the U.S. closed its door, the global market opened another. Europe absorbed nearly double its usual volume of Canadian aluminum during the summer months, confirming that Canada is not trapped in a North American bubble. The tariff accelerated diversification, and Canada became stronger because of it. The second lesson is that Trump broke the very supply chain he claimed he was protecting. For decades, North America operated under an unwritten agreement. Canada produced clean, stable, reliable aluminum, and the United States consumed it. Trump shattered that balance overnight. Industry leaders on both sides of the border warned that a 50% tariff was unsustainable for an integrated industrial system. They were right. U.S. producers of cars, beverage cans, aircraft components, and infrastructure materials suddenly faced higher input costs. Those expenses cascaded through the supply chain, ultimately landing in consumer prices. In a political moment where U.S. inflation is already sensitive, Trump's tariff became an additional tax on American families. The third lesson is about leverage, and it may be the most uncomfortable truth for Washington. The aluminum dispute exposed something Trump never admits. The U.S. needs Canada far more than Canada needs the U.S. America simply does not have enough domestic aluminum capacity to replace Canadian supply. Turning to other foreign suppliers is complicated. Some involve geopolitical concerns, sanctions, or unstable markets. Canadian aluminum, meanwhile, is produced with hydroelectric power and meets the highest environmental standards in the world. It is exactly the kind of metal U.S. manufacturers want: clean, consistent, and reliable. When Canada withdrew almost half of its supply, U.S. buyers had only two choices: pay more or risk shortages. They chose to pay more. That is not a show of strength from the United States. It is a demonstration of Canadian leverage. And while the U.S. was scrambling to patch the gaps, Canada's confidence only grew. Ottawa recognized that diversification wasn't just a defensive move, it was a strategic upgrade. By opening wider channels to Europe and reinforcing ties across the Indo-Pacific, Canada reduced its exposure to U.S. volatility. In other words, Trump's tariff didn't isolate Canada, it pushed Canada to become even more globally connected. There is also a political reality unfolding in Washington. Trump's trade agenda is now being criticized not only by Democrats, but by American businesses that once supported him. The aluminum tariff added new pressure to an economy already strained by wider tariff battles with China, Mexico, Canada, and Europe. Every new tariff raises costs somewhere else in the economy. Trump claims this is part of a long-term industrial revival. But to ordinary Americans, it looks like rising prices, shrinking competition, and confusion over why their country keeps picking fights that weaken its own supply chains. Canada, meanwhile, responded with discipline. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, the approach was not combative theatrics, but strategic repositioning. Ottawa allowed the market to do its work. Producers were given the freedom to redirect exports. Diplomatic channels stayed open. Canada avoided the emotional escalation that Trump often relies on. And in the end, Canada emerged as the more stable, more predictable, and more globally connected economy. The aluminum pivot also reinforces a broader trend in 2025. Canada is becoming the calm anchor in a turbulent global landscape. Investors see it, manufacturers see it, and even American companies now recognize that Canada remains one of the world's most reliable industrial partners, even if their own government treats us like a target rather than an ally.
The aluminum tariff was supposed to be Trump's demonstration of strength. Instead, it exposed the vulnerability of America's industrial system and the resilience of Canada's. Canada avoided the economic hit Trump intended, expanded its global connections, strengthened its market position, and ultimately sold its aluminum back to the United States, but only once Americans accepted the higher cost. This dispute leaves a clear and unavoidable question: if a single tariff can fracture North America's supply chain and push U.S. prices higher, what happens when Trump's next round of protectionism arrives? Because one thing is now certain: Canada can adapt, Canada can pivot, Canada can find new markets. The real instability is coming from the South, and the world is beginning to notice.
Since 1872, the famed Siebel Institute has taught the fine art and science of brewing to generations in Chicago. But it has announced it will soon be last call in the U.S. Siebel issued a statement pointing to changes under the Trump administration. Recent regulatory changes in the U.S. have made it much more challenging for many of our international students who have become the majority of our student body to attend classes in person.
Canada just landed a win that says more about the future of North America than most people realize. A 150-year-old American institution, the Siebel Institute of Technology, one of the oldest and most respected brewing schools on the continent, is leaving Chicago. Not because of market failure, not because of lack of demand, but because the United States, under Donald Trump's tightening regulations, has made it too difficult for international students to study there. And so, the school is moving to Montreal. A quiet relocation on paper, but a loud signal in reality. It's a moment that captures the shift underway in North America. The United States is closing its doors, while Canada is opening wider than ever.
The Siebel Institute, founded in 1868, confirmed that it will officially relocate from Chicago to Montreal in early 2026. The school didn't give interviews, but its written statement told the entire story. It explained that recent regulatory changes in the U.S. have made it, quote, much more challenging for many of our international students who have become the majority of our student body to attend classes in person. That line, delivered in corporate language, reveals a much bigger truth. America's immigration and visa barriers, strengthened since Trump's return to the White House, have pushed out the very people who keep specialized schools alive. International students aren't a luxury for Siebel, they are the backbone of the program. When they can no longer enter the country with confidence, the school can no longer survive in its original home.
Meanwhile, the school's parent company, Montreal-based Lallemande, sees Canada as the natural place to rebuild. Quebec already has a strong food science sector, Montreal already has the ecosystem to support the school, and Canada's immigration system is far more predictable for global learners. Back in Chicago, the reaction was emotional. Industry members called the move a big loss, and some openly admitted heartbreak. But they also acknowledged a hard reality. If students can't get in, the school can't function. The Midwest beer community is losing not just an institution, but a symbol of its identity.
For decades, the U.S. was the automatic destination for international students. Today, that trend is reversing. The Seibel move is a textbook example of a broader shift. Institutions that once depended on the American system are now seeking stability elsewhere. Canada has become that elsewhere. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, the federal government has made attracting global talent a central pillar of its economic strategy. Immigration pathways are stable, visas are processed more consistently, and the political climate encourages growth rather than restriction. That contrast with today's United States could not be sharper. Schools that rely on global students are watching their U.S. enrollment fall. Some programs are downsizing. Others are considering hybrid structures to avoid visa complications. Seibel didn't want to play that game, so it simply left.
Recent regulatory changes may sound vague, but everyone in the industry knows exactly what it means. Since Trump returned to office in 2025, new rules around student visas, work study permits, and short-term training programs have made it significantly harder for international students to enter the U.S. These aren't abstract rules, they directly affect specialized institutions like Seibel, where most of the class comes from abroad. Instead of adjusting, Seibel opted out. Its leadership decided the regulatory climate wasn't worth a fight. In the simplest terms, Trump's policies didn't protect American institutions, they pushed them out. The loss of Seibel isn't just administrative. It's symbolic. Chicago has long been a powerhouse in the craft beer world, and Seibel has been part of that identity for generations. Losing the oldest brewing school in the United States because the country can't welcome its own students is a blow to America's cultural soft power. This is about more than brewing. It's about what an open society can attract and what a closed one drives away. When a heritage institution leaves because the environment has become too restrictive, it signals a deeper structural problem. While the U.S. is losing a legacy institution, Quebec is gaining a new strategic asset. Montreal is already home to Lallemande, a global leader in fermentation and food science. The province has a vibrant craft beer sector, strong culinary innovation, and a growing academic ecosystem around food technology. The move instantly elevates Montreal's status in the global brewing landscape. Industry leaders in Quebec have already said the relocation will put Montreal, Quebec on the map for that knowledge. That's not exaggeration, it's reality. The school will bring students, specialized instructors, and research capacity directly into Quebec's hands. At a time when Carney is pushing Canada to diversify away from U.S. economic dependency, the symbolism couldn't be clearer. Even America's cultural institutions are starting to drift north. The U.S. won't openly acknowledge the deeper meaning of Seibel's move, but the implications are undeniable. It signals that America is no longer the default destination for global talent, and that Canada is emerging as the safer, more stable choice. Carney's strategy has been to position Canada as a hub of skilled immigration, academic excellence, and industry diversification. Seibel's decision aligns perfectly with that vision. While Trump tightens the borders, Canada becomes the magnet for the institutions that still want to think globally. This is how geopolitical shifts actually happen, not through dramatic speeches, but through hundreds of decisions made by organizations seeking stability. Seibel didn't announce a political statement, but its decision functions like one. Montreal becomes the beneficiary, Chicago becomes the cautionary tale.
On the surface, this might look like a niche story about brewing, but the deeper narrative is about competition, identity, and the future of North America. Trump's restrictive regulatory climate has driven out a 150-year-old institution that helped define American craft beer. Canada didn't steal it, America pushed it away. And now Montreal, not Chicago, will be training the next generation of brewers. That's the shift. That's the headline. That's the new reality. What do you think? If this is what happens in specialized training today, what will happen when larger institutions, universities, hospitals, research centers begin making the same calculation?